The Shroud Wanderer. The village of Hollowmere sat nestled in a forgotten corner of the world, where the hills sagged under the weight of ancient secrets, and the air carried a perpetual chill that clung to the skin like damp cloth. It was a place where time seemed to falter, where the past and present blurred into a haze of half-remembered tales. The villagers, insular and wary, spoke in hushed tones of the old burial ground beyond the Willow Grove, a place no one dared visit after dusk. They called it the Shroud Yard, and it was said that the dead there did not rest easy. Elias Kane, a drifter with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, arrived in Hollowmere on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn. He carried nothing but a tattered satchel and a journal bound in cracked leather. The villagers eyed him with suspicion, their gazes sharp as the wind that howled through the skeletal trees. Elias had no intention of staying long. He was a collector of stories, a man drawn to the edges of the world where the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. Hollowmere, with its whispered legends of the Shroud Yard, was just another stop on his endless pilgrimage. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman named Mara, with hair like spun silver, offered him a room but warned him to steer clear of the grove. "The Shroud Yard's no place for the living," she said, her voice low, as if the walls themselves might overhear. "After 40 days, they rise. Wrapped in their burial cloths, they wander. Not all of them, mind you, but the ones with unfinished business. You'd do well to stay away." Elias nodded, his lips curling into a faint, skeptical smile. He'd heard such tales before, ghost stories spun to keep children in line or strangers at bay. But there was something in Mara's eyes, a flicker of dread so raw it made his skin prickle. He thanked her and retired to his room, where he opened his journal and began to write. The rain battered the window, and the wind carried faint, mournful cries that he dismissed as imagination. The next day, Elias ventured into the village, seeking the stories that had drawn him here. The locals were tight-lipped, their answers curt and evasive. Only old Tom, a half-blind man who spent his days carving crude wooden charms by the tavern hearth, was willing to speak. His voice was a rasp, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The Shroud Wanderer," he called it. "Not one soul, but many. They come after 40 days, when the earth rejects them. They drift through the Shroud Yard, bound in white, searching for what they lost in life. Some say they're looking for peace. Others say they're hungry for it." Elias leaned closer, his pen scratching across the page. "Have you seen it?" he asked, Tom's milky eyes fixed on him, unseeing yet piercing. "Seen it? No. Felt it? Aye. You feel it in your bones, lad. A cold that ain't natural. A weight, like someone standing just behind you, breathing down your neck." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The storm had worsened, and the inn creaked under its assault. The tales of the Shroud Wanderer gnawed at him, not because he believed them, but because they stirred a memory he couldn't place, a fragment of a dream, perhaps, or a story half forgotten. He lit a candle and pored over his journal, rereading notes from other towns, other legends, but his thoughts kept drifting to the Shroud Yard, to the image of figures draped in white, moving silently through the mist. By the third night, curiosity or something darker overpowered his caution. He waited until the village was asleep, then slipped out into the rain-slicked darkness. The willow grove loomed ahead, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Beyond it lay the Shroud Yard, a sunken patch of earth, encircled by crooked iron fences. The graves were old, their stones weathered and moss-eaten, some so ancient the names had worn away entirely. Elias moved carefully, his lantern casting a weak halo of light. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. He told himself he was here to observe, to document, but his heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers, or perhaps the rustle of leaves. He couldn't be sure. Then he saw it at the edge of the Shroud Yard, where the mist hung low. A figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form shrouded in a tattered white cloth that clung to its frame like a second skin. The cloth was stained, streaked with mud and something darker, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if its limbs were bound too tightly. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him, but he felt its presence like a weight pressing against his chest. He took a step back, his boot sinking into the mud. The figure twitched, its head snapping toward him with a speed that made his stomach lurch. There was no face beneath the shroud, only a void where features should have been, a black, empty expanse that seemed to pull at the light. Elias stumbled, his lantern slipping from his hand and shattering on the ground. The darkness swallowed him, and the figure began to move. It didn't walk. It glided, its shrouded feet hovering just above the earth. The cloth rustled, a dry, scraping sound that drowned out the storm. Elias ran, his heart hammering, his mind screaming at him to move faster. The grove seemed to stretch endlessly, the willows twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at his clothes. Behind him, the rustling grew louder, closer, until he could feel that unnatural cold seeping into his bones. He burst into the village, collapsing against the inn's door. Mara found him there, drenched and trembling, his eyes wild. She didn't ask questions, only helped him inside and barred the door. "You saw it," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Elias could only nod, his voice lost to the terror, still clawing at his mind. The next morning, he resolved to leave Hollowmere. He packed his satchel, his hands shaking as he stuffed his journal inside. But when he opened it to write one final entry, he froze. The pages were no longer his own. The words he'd written, notes on folklore, sketches of graves, were gone. In their place were lines of jagged, unfamiliar script, scrawled in a language he couldn't read. And at the bottom of the final page, inked in a deep rust-red hue, was a single phrase: 40 days. Elias burned the journal that night, watching the flames consume the pages until nothing remained but ash. He left Hollowmere at dawn, vowing never to return. But the cold followed him. In every town, every shadowed corner, he felt it, that weight, that presence, just out of sight. He stopped sleeping, stopped writing. The world grew dim, as if the light itself were fading. 40 days after he fled Hollowmere, Elias vanished. His satchel was found in a ditch by a lonely road, its contents scattered. The villagers who found it spoke of a figure seen in the distance, draped in white, drifting through the mist. They burned the satchel and spoke no more of it. But the shroud yard remains, and the whispers persist. The dead do not rest in Hollowmere. After 40 days, they rise, bound in their burial cloths, searching for what they lost or for those foolish enough to seek them out. And somewhere, in the shadows of the willow grove, the shroud wanderer waits, its faceless gaze fixed on the next soul to cross its path.